Konrad Pirotta is a teacher in biology. They has been teaching for more than 25 years. He has also been announced as a European Climate Pact ambassador by the European Commission, and is one of the lead teachers on this 3 Rs project that Marcel presented. So, Konrad, the floor is yours, if you want to share your screen.
Yes. Hello, first of all, and good evening to everyone. I will put on my presentation, and you should see it now. Is that okay?
Yes, it's good.
Right. Okay, so basically my presentation is about one of the learning scenarios that was developed some time ago with a colleague of mine. It's basically about replacement, how, or rather innovative techniques that can now or in the future replace animal testing. I will go through the various stages and also explain an example of how this was implemented in our classes. So the idea that we had come up with was to present this idea that humans can do research, or humans can, for example, find cures to diseases without necessarily having to refer to animals or produce maybe new products or test liquids or whatever. We can do it in a way without relying on animals. That was the basic concept. Um, so as you can see on the slide, the general aim was to introduce to students these modern approaches. Of course, before this, there's a sort of introduction about the 3 Rs themselves and about animal testing itself, because animal testing is not something that we talk about every day, and therefore that was the initial step. Talk about the animal testing as things stand now, and what can be done or what are the possible alternatives. We set a number of objectives. First of all, animal testing is not 100% beneficial. There are a number of disadvantages, as you just heard. For example, certain tests on animals are not reliable. You would get a totally different result if you had to do the same tests on humans. From there, then you need to explain, you need to introduce the 3 Rs themselves, and the next step would be sort of the discovery step, which is offering the alternatives and asking students to research about them and eventually present their own idea about that particular alternative. So we have these steps that we need to follow in order to make this successful, in order to make the idea, present the idea of alternative techniques as successful as possible. So our suggestion was this. We start off with a brainstorming session whereby we ask students to give us their background knowledge, okay, what is known as prior knowledge, introducing the whole concept of animal testing. Students would have an idea about the fact that animals are used for science. How much they would know would vary a lot, or you could even ask students to simply prepare something short, say 1 week before this particular lesson. So that would be the first step. I will explain it further in a minute. Once that is done, the introduction to the 3 Rs is carried out. And then once that is done, once they know what the 3 Rs are, a task is given to students. The task, more or less, is to have students in groups. Each group will carry out some research about the alternative to animal testing, and then let's say a week later, they would present in one way or another this particular replacement technique. And they would do it in such a way that they would make a strong case for this replacement, for example, to be funded for research projects. So this would be a sort of role play. I will explain how this is done shortly. So there's a brainstorm so that you are aware of what students already know, and then introducing the 3 Rs and then the task. And the task, as you can see, happens in a two-stage process: the research and then presenting what the research, sort of what came out of the research. Here, I would like to point out, please, that we did not ask students simply go on the internet and look for information. We had a considerable number of websites, of links that we had already checked ourselves, and these links were passed on to the students to help them focus. Otherwise, they might be looking at things which were either out of context or far too advanced for a particular level of students. Okay, well, these links are also found in the learning scenario. So this was something guided, I must say. Okay, so this was something guided. So the brainstorm as such, of course, when we do a brainstorming sessions, we must be open to any idea. Um, we have to avoid excessive guiding. Otherwise, some ideas, maybe even if they are wrong, but might not come out. The use of mind maps or spider diagrams is highly recommended during this brainstorm, maybe on a board or on a whiteboard. And our role as teachers was to facilitate and coordinate the session rather than to lead it or to sort of promote our own ideas or sort of support the 3 Rs. At this stage, this was um, investigating prior knowledge and collecting information. As you can see in the last line, if there are doubts whether students would know enough, would even have basic ideas about animal testing, this could also be a preliminary activity to ask students to maybe prepare a little statement or a little drawing, something. What do I know so far about animal testing? So once we collect the ideas from the brainstorming session, then we have to define what animal testing means, what what falls under the definition of animal testing, the idea of using animals in science in a very wide context. And also there are commercial links to animal testing. Okay, because if I am testing some goods, if I am testing the safety of a product, there are also, of course, commercial interests. And this also falls under animal testing. There are two examples there: testing of vaccines, verifying the safety of new foods that are supposed to go on the market. Once we have a clear picture of what the situation looks like now, then we offer this alternative. Okay, we offer the idea of the 3 Rs and we pick one of them. Okay, in our case, we picked up replacement. So we know what the situation looks like now. What can we do about it? That is the sort of approach that we actually used. And then we introduced the task. So in this case, we had our students in groups of 4, and each group is given one of the alternatives, one of obviously that currently exists. Okay, one of the options that we have at the moment that can replace or at least reduce by a very large extent the use of animals or animal testing sessions in a particular um, domain, in a particular field of science. The class was given 1 week, and after 1 week, we organized a role play. So we had 4 groups of 4, that's 16 students, and their job was basically to rotate. So 2 of the groups were sort of a general public kind of thing. One of the group was a panel of experts that would decide whether or not a particular project would merit funding, and the fourth group was the group presenting its findings, its research, sort of showing off, proving, giving evidence that this alternative really works. Okay, that this alternative really works, and this obviously took place 4 times. Each time, one group had an opportunity to present its work. One group was the panel of experts, and the other two were representing the general public. Okay, this is more or less also how, for example, environmental impact assessments work. And this was done in the form of a workshop. The four research fields were these: stem cells used for heart surgery, organ on a chip, virtual reality in surgery, and computer simulations. The last two, of course, are important for research, important for practice, and today this is a reality. Okay, this we can carry out, let's say, a surgery on the kidneys in a virtual way, making sure that whoever is doing the surgery is going to the right place, is not damaging other vital organs or a vascular system, or what would normally be sort of the most difficult part of a particular surgery on the intestine, for example. One of the tools we gave to our students was this. These are the 6 thinking hats. So once they got the information, they analyzed the information following this procedure. What are the facts? What are the positive aspects? What are the negative aspects? And we did this because when it comes to animal testing, sometimes we tend to follow emotions, for example, rather than facts. And of course, today, as we all know, once you go on the internet, there's always the problem whether something is fake or real. So we had to give some sort of tool to help our students sieve through, analyze the information they collected, and finally get something out of it. In our case, our students are not very much used to this, so help was definitely important. After the role play, we came up with a number of conclusions. Okay, for example, animal testing is a very diverse theme and is taking place within a large array of fields, both scientific as well as commercial. This was something that most students would definitely not be aware of how widespread animal testing is. We normally associate animal testing with the medical field, but it's not just there. As somebody already said, if I want a new product on the market, more often than not, this has to go through a series of animal testing phases. That was definitely something most students were not aware. Even, for example, foods or chemicals that we use at home, these need to be animal tested. And this was definitely something that was a novelty. There's also a lot of positive that students came up with. For example, the fact that in many parts of the world, animal testing for the production of cosmetics is now no longer possible. It's either illegal or is very restricted. So that was obviously something very positive. And as I said at the beginning, animal testing procedures sometimes just don't give us the data we need, and that the data might actually be the opposite, or it might not be reliable, and the alternatives give us something more reliable and closer to what you would expect to have in a human being. Um, uh, for example, this is very true when it comes to viruses. The way some animals react to particular viruses is, or to treatments for viruses, unfortunately, is very different to what we as humans would expect. We would have a different reaction, and therefore animal testing there would be more or less useless, if not counterproductive. And then, of course, we discussed feedback. So this was another session. We allowed students another week to give us some feedback, and then the feedback was discussed. The most important thing, the most recurring type piece of feedback was the fact that this was something interesting and something that students felt um, relevant, especially students who wanted to pursue a medical career. They learned something not from a book, not from their teacher, but from their own personal research, which they found very beneficial. And of course, because they were guided, and this is very important, they weren't just searching anywhere, but they had specific pointers on which links to go for and what was the most relevant, it wasn't difficult for them to come up with usable information. So I think that is very, very important because going to primary literature is good, of course, going to scientific papers, but it might not be at a level which the students understand, or they would need some other background which is not available. Of course, there is always the issue that if you're going for something medical, you will probably end up finding things which require more knowledge to understand. But somehow that was easily overcome and mitigated by these groups of students. And then things were simply new, completely new, like virtual reality in surgery. Very few students were aware that you could get something so accurate and so similar to the human body itself. Things like 3D imagery, where you are actually seeing how close you are to doing the right thing, or if you cause damage. Of course, most students knew that you had such simulators, for example, for pilots or for aeroplanes, but they were not aware that this also existed in medicine, for example. Probably the organ on a chip was the one that was sort of most alien, that students found very interesting and completely new, a very important novelty. And the fact that you can have something which is almost non-organic, okay, organic, but not in the way we normally perceive it, and it could give you the same response as an organic tissue or as an organ itself, was very fascinating. And some students said this is practically a new branch in biology. We have to invent sort of a new subject because definitely it wasn't something that was available even maybe a decade ago or two. So coming back to reality, although these alternatives exist, but of course we can't say that anytime soon animal testing will disappear completely. And this was sort of a supplementary exercise that you can also use maybe to carry on with the subject, let's say the following year. Uh, Having seen what is available now and what progress has been made, and coming to terms with the fact that animal testing still exists and will exist at least in some areas in the foreseeable future, then the next step would be, what can we do to improve the living conditions of animals during animal testing and after? Because we are very much aware that some animals do suffer during the phase of animal testing, but almost we never discuss what happens after. If these animals are still alive, what happens where they are no longer useful? And we had a little discussion here. What can we do, or what can be done, or what legislation is possible in order to ensure the well-being of animals during and especially after um, their contribution is over. And of course, this is where sort of new ideas can be generated. Of course, laws are important, but you have to have funding, you have to have someone who's ready to take care of these animals, and ensure that they would have a good quality of life and they are not harmed to an extent that their life then becomes a hell once this phase is over. So the idea was to sort of have a comprehensive, obviously basic, but a comprehensive overview of animal testing, the alternatives available, and very important to get to know about them, because this is not something we normally discuss in our everyday life, or even in our subject as biology. And then the third phase is, okay, there's a lot that we can improve, but still animal testing is still with us. And what can we do to improve the conditions of our animals during and after this phase of their life? So that was sort of a concluding exercise, or You could also use it as a supplementary exercise if you'd like to take this a little bit further. If this needs to be assessed, we also came up with a rubric for assessing this particular assignment. So you could come up with a system of marks, and these marks can be divided according to this rubric, and this would make correcting and assessing this this task, this assignment easier, and hopefully a bit less subjective. As we all know, this is a major issue in biology. How do we assess in a fair and consistent way? Because this is not maths, it's not right or wrong. You need to have some sort of marking scheme. You need to have set standards so that marking is fair. And we came up with this rubric, which can be used as a marking scheme. And we have there 4 parameters. How good was the group work? And this can be done for every individual student to see his or her contribution. The product, the presentation they came up with, and then of course the more cognitive part that sort of shows the level of discussion of each group, the values that were demonstrated, and finally the level of creativity, for example, in the way they presented their work, or the way they carried out their research, or the way they validated their work to decide what was useful and what wasn't. Of course, this is quite a task, but if you need to assess this particular assignment, this particular learning scenario, I think this could be useful, of course, according to the system uh, being applied. Any questions, please? That was more or less a quick overview of our scenario.